As the first rays of sunlight filtered into Ibrahim Traoré's study, he was reviewing the day's government affairs. As Burkina Faso's leader, his mornings usually began with agricultural projects, border security reports, and diplomatic correspondence with neighboring states. But this morning, something strange was among the routine paperwork. Inside the envelope, devoid of any identifying markings, lay only an old photograph and a handwritten message. The photo showed a scene from 1960, French officials standing next to wooden crates being loaded onto a military cargo plane. Traoré immediately recognized the location as Ouagadougou's old airport, now a bustling commercial hub. The handwritten message was brief but striking. 40 tons of gold taken, not as compensation, but as theft. The evidence is present. The gold is present. 72 hours remain before the documents are destroyed forever. A long-delayed account awaits settlement. Below it were numbers and letters resembling coordinates, followed by a local saying Traoré knew from his childhood: "The spirit of the ancestors seeks justice." Traoré examined the photograph carefully. If true, it documented a truth that had long been whispered about in Burkina Faso, just days before independence was declared in 1960. The withdrawing French colonial administration had removed vast gold stocks accumulated over decades of exploitation. His intercom rang. "Get me Minister Ouedraogo and Security Director Ouedraogo immediately." Within half an hour, his most trusted advisors gathered in his office. Finance Minister Amsatou Ouedraogo, a brilliant economist who had graduated from the Sorbonne and returned to serve his country, viewed the photograph with professional skepticism. "Mr. President, we must proceed with caution. This could be a manipulation aimed at creating diplomatic tensions with France at this sensitive time." Security Director Michel Ouedraogo expressed similar concerns. "The timing is suspicious. Just as we're renegotiating mining contracts with international companies, someone presents you with evidence of colonial-era theft." Traoré assessed their concerns. Tensions with France had risen since Burkina Faso had established increased national control over its natural resources, particularly the gold deposits, which had previously been exploited under unbalanced treaties that favored foreign firms. "You're right," Traoré said. "But what if this evidence is genuine? 40 tons of gold at today's prices could completely transform our development capacity." He pointed to the coordinates in the message. "It indicates a location in Geneva, Switzerland." Minister Ouedraogo frowned. "Europe's financial center. Interesting. We need to verify this discreetly," Traoré decided. "If colonial-era officials did indeed take our national gold reserves, the documentation must be in either our or their archives." "What if it's true?" Ouedraogo asked. "Then we will reclaim what is rightfully ours," Traoré replied simply. "Not by military force, but by historical justice." Within hours, a small team was assembled to investigate the mysterious message. Professor Salif Kabore, director of the National Archives of Burkina Faso, was assigned to search for records related to colonial-era gold reserves. Meanwhile, a digital forensics expert began examining the photo for signs of manipulation. In the evening, the initial findings were presented to Traoré. The photo bore no trace of digital alteration and was consistent with documented colonial-era images. Even more telling, Professor Kabore discovered a surprising gap in the National Financial Archives during the 3 months leading up to independence in 1960. "It's as if those pages were deliberately omitted," Kabore explained, showing Traoré a bound volume with missing sections. "The important thing is that the records before and after this period meticulously document gold production and stocks." Security Director Ouedraogo reported that the coordinates in the message pointed to a specific box at a private safe deposit box facility in Geneva. "It's not a bank, but a private storage firm that caters to clients seeking privacy." "We've also tracked the envelope," Ouedraogo continued. "It was delivered yesterday by a European to a government postal worker. Security cameras recorded it, but initial facial recognition scans found no match in our database." Traoré made a decision. "I need to go quietly to Geneva." Both advisors immediately objected. It seemed reckless for the president to leave the country so quickly after an anonymous tip. "Send diplomatic representatives or a secret agent," Ouedraogo suggested. Traoré nodded. "If this really concerns our country's stolen wealth, It should be retrieved by the elected leader of Burkina Faso. Besides, he added, picking up the message, this message was specifically addressed to me. The sender is waiting for me personally. After intense discussions, a compromise was reached. Traoré would travel to Switzerland for an impromptu meeting on sustainable development initiatives. He would be accompanied by a minimal security detail to maintain a low profile. Meanwhile, Minister Ouédraogo was to lead a team investigating historical records of colonial-era gold reserves in Burkina Faso and through diplomatic channels with France. If this message is genuine, we only have 72 hours, Traoré reminded him. If not, we've lost more than a little of our time. Before dawn the next morning, Traoré boarded a government plane with a small delegation. As the plane soared above the West African landscape, he found himself examining the mysterious photograph again. The faces of the French colonial officials showed no signs of guilt or secrecy, just the casual expressions of men performing their official duties. But if the message was true, this photograph documented one of the greatest thefts in African history. The flight to Geneva was spent reviewing briefing documents his team had prepared overnight. Gold production in Burkina Faso, then known as Colonial Upper Volta, was significant, and records showed that gold was being continuously extracted from many regions. But at the time of independence, no mention of gold reserves had been made in the official asset transfer, and this absence had never been questioned. As the plane landed in Geneva, Traoré considered the possibilities. Burkina Faso, despite possessing significant natural resources, remained one of the world's poorest countries. If the colonial gold had indeed been stolen and could be recovered, it would mean not only financial salvation, but also historical justice. The Swiss city welcomed them with its characteristic efficiency and discretion. After a modest diplomatic welcome at the airport, they were escorted by secure motorcade to a boutique hotel in the city center. An hour after their arrival, Traoré, accompanied by Security Director Ouédraogo and a single bodyguard, set off for the coordinates specified in the mysterious message. The location turned out to be a modest building in Geneva's financial district. Its marble facade didn't reveal its purpose at all. Only a small brass plaque over the entrance read, Security Discret SA. Inside, the receptionist greeted them with professional detachment. We think there's a safe reserved for us, Traoré said, showing the alphanumeric code in the message. The receptionist examined the code, then made a discreet phone call. A few minutes later, an elderly man in an impeccable suit emerged from the inner office. President Traoré, he said with a slight bow. I'm Monsieur Blanc, the facilities manager. This is quite unusual. Diplomatic visits usually require advance notice. I understand, Traoré replied, but the matter is both urgent and confidential. Blanc eyed him carefully, then nodded. The box you're looking for is indeed set up with unusual provisions. Only the incumbent president of Burkina Faso can access it by presenting this special code and within the time frame specified in the original agreement. What is that time frame? Traoré asked. The box is permanently sealed exactly 72 hours after you are notified. According to our records, that leaves you. He glanced at his tablet. About 58 hours. Blanc led them through a succession of security checkpoints, each more sophisticated than the last. Finally, they entered a climate-controlled safe. The walls were lined with safes of various sizes, each bearing only a number. Box 1960-081, Blanc said, pointing to a medium-sized drawer. If you give me the access code. Traoré entered the code from the message into the digital keypad. After a moment, a soft click was heard, and the drawer opened a few centimeters. I'll leave you alone, Blanc said, stepping back. When you're ready to examine the contents, please use the consultation room behind that door. Left alone with the box, Traoré locked eyes with Ouédraogo. Whatever it contained could change the future of their country. With steady hands, Traoré opened the drawer completely, revealing a sealed metal box. He lifted the box, surprisingly heavy for its size, and carried it to the consultation room. Inside the sealed box was a USB stick, a leather-bound diary with yellowed pages, and a small gold key, a departure from modern designs. The diary bore the emblem of Upper Volta's French colonial administration. Ouédraogo carefully connected the USB stick to a secure laptop they had brought. The stick contained hundreds of scanned documents, official colonial records, correspondence between Paris and the colonial administrators, and detailed inventories of gold reserves accumulated between 1945 and 1960. Most notably, there were orders for the strategic relocation of precious metal assets in anticipation of the territorial transition. Bureaucratic language used to disguise the planned relocation of gold reserves just before independence. The diary was even more revealing. It was the personal diary of Jean-Baptiste Mercier, a mid-level French colonial administrator who had meticulously documented the gold transfer operation. His diary entries described his growing unease with the task. April 12, 1960. The scale of the operation becomes clearer every day. 40 tons of gold, accumulated over decades from the mines of Upper Volta, will be transported without the knowledge of the new African government. I conveyed my concerns about the legality to Commissioner Dubois, who reminded me that technically all assets remain French property until the official date of independence, a legalistic view that ignores moral reality. Later entries detailed the logistics of secretly transporting this amount of gold, including the creation of forged documents claiming that the region's historical gold production was much lower. The final entry, dated August 3, 1960, 2 days before Upper Volta's independence, contained the most serious accusation. The last plane left today, the coffers are empty. Paris has taken its gold, and Upper Volta will begin its path to nationhood with empty coffers. Commissioner Dubois celebrated our successful asset protection. I cannot share his satisfaction. History may call this prudent colonial rule. Truth will call it theft. But the biggest mystery posed the golden key. The documents contained no explanation of its purpose. This evidence is extraordinary, Ouédraogo said quietly after examining everything. But evidence alone will not bring back the gold. Where are 40 tons of gold now? Traore examined the key closely. The colonial administration may have transferred it to Paris, but they did not publicly record its origin from Upper Volta. It was included in the French national reserves, making it virtually impossible to identify or recover, Ouédraogo concluded. Perhaps not, Traore said thoughtfully. Mercier was clearly remorseful. He documented everything and ensured that evidence was preserved. What if he did more? What if this key leads to something else? As he carefully repacked his belongings, a text message arrived from Minister Ouédraogo in Ouagadougou. The colonial archives confirm an unusual gap. French diplomatic officials responded to our questions with a strangely defensive tone. You were right. Something significant happened before independence. Back at their hotel, Traore held a secure video conference with his team in Ouagadougou. Minister Ouédraogo reported that their secret investigations into historic gold transfers had elicited unexpected reactions from French officials. Not denials, but digressions and sudden diplomatic inaccessibility. There's more, he added. We've identified a pattern in colonial gold production reports. Official records show production declining in the 1950s, but mining employment increased during the same period. Production was systematically underreported. Professor Traore, director of the National Archives, explained his findings. In 1960, we discovered secret correspondence from nationalist leaders, questioning the whereabouts of their gold reserves. Their investigation was dismissed by the transitional authorities as accounting misunderstandings. The new government, eager to maintain good relations with France, did not pursue the matter further. Traore shared what he had found in Geneva, evidence of systematic gold theft and the mysterious key. The documents confirm that the gold was taken to France, he explained, but retrieving it will be extremely difficult. We will need to prove that the specific gold in today's French reserves came from our territory 60 years ago. Unless, of course, suggested Minister Ouédraogo, Mercier didn't just leave the documents. That key must have a purpose. Security Chief Ouédraogo silently examined the key. It's an old-fashioned safe key, but not a Swiss design. It was manufactured in France in the mid-20th century. So, we need to find a French bank with a 60-year-old safe, Traore concluded. But which one? There must be something in these documents that tells us that. They spent hours analyzing the documents, searching for any clues to the key's purpose. Finally, Professor Traore noticed something in Mercier's diary. The phrases, to ensure partition and divided security, appeared intermittently. I think he was using coded language, Traoré explained. He didn't trust the other administrators. What if he had divided the evidence? The documents are in Switzerland, but something else is in France? Traoré examined the diary entries again and noticed a pattern. When Mercier mentioned partition or secession, he was also referring to his personal visits to Paris, specifically the Old Quarter, or where scholars gathered. The Latin Quarter, Traoré noticed, is the intellectual heart of Paris. A search of historical records of banks and secure storage facilities in Paris's Latin Quarter from the 1960s onward revealed a promising clue. A small private bank, known for its secrecy and centuries-old safe deposit system, serving academics and publishing houses. Although the bank was taken over by a larger financial institution in the 1980s, its original safe deposit box was reportedly still in operation. I need to go to Paris, Traoré decided. Now. Minister Ouédraogo vehemently objected. Mr. President, entering France with this information would be a great risk. French intelligence would certainly be monitoring your movements right now. So we need to pull off a deception, Traoré replied. Announce to the public that I will be attending an economic forum in Brussels tomorrow. Diplomatic channels have probably been compromised, so they will assume it's true. Within hours, a carefully crafted plan was set in motion. While official statements indicated that President Traoré would travel to Brussels, his plane was actually scheduled to fly to Luxembourg. From there, he would travel to Paris by secure ground transport, implementing a communications blackout, except on encrypted channels. Before leaving Geneva, Traoré had one last assignment. He returned to Security Discret SA and requested a meeting with Director Blanc. The materials we found were quite revealing, Traoré said, but I'm curious about who installed this box and when. Blanc looked at his records. The box was installed in 1965 by French citizen Jean-Baptiste Mercier. At the time, extraordinary access conditions were established, and automatic notifications would be sent if the box wasn't accessed within 60 years of its installation. So, am I the first person to access it? Yes, Mr. President. The notification was scheduled to be sent to your position in 2025, 60 years after the box was created. So why did I receive the notification now, 5 years early? Blanc looked surprised. I can't explain it, Mr. President. Our systems are automated and don't activate ahead of schedule. This revelation added a new dimension to the mystery. Someone had deliberately accelerated Mercier's plan, sending the notification years ahead of schedule for activation. But who and why now? The journey to Paris was tense but uneventful. Using the diplomatic resources of a friendly European country, Traoré and his minimum security team slipped into France undetected. They arrived in the Latin Quarter at midnight, its narrow streets practically deserted at that hour. The former private bank was now a branch of the Crédit National, its historic facade preserved but its interior modernized. A pre-arranged meeting with the night manager, arranged through clandestine financial channels without Traoré's identity being disclosed, gave them access to the original vault. No one has touched these old boxes for years, the manager explained as he led them down to the underground floor. We keep them for their historical value and for the few old clients who insist on using them. The vault design was markedly different from the Swiss facility, less technological, more mechanical, with brass fixtures and ornate metalwork reflecting its 19th century origins. Traoré gave the number engraved on the gold key, and they were directed to the appropriate box. When the key turned in the lock, the heavy drawer opened smoothly, revealing a sealed metal tube about a meter long. The manager excused himself, leaving Traoré and Ouédraogo alone with the mysterious container. Inside the tube was a rolled-up document protected by a waterproof cover. When they carefully unrolled it on the inspection table, they found something extraordinary: a detailed map of a facility in rural France, and notes written in Mercier's now familiar handwriting. The caption identified it as Réserve d'Or Nationale, Site C, one of France's gold storage facilities. Crucially, the map highlighted a specific section labeled Acquisitions Colonials 1945 to 1960, Colonial Acquisitions 1945 to 1960, which contained detailed vault numbers, security protocols, and an administrator access code handwritten in the margin. Mercier had given them a complete map of the stolen gold. But there was more. Attached to the map was a typewritten letter addressed to the future leader of Upper Volta, Burkina Faso. If you are reading this, it has been 60 years since I participated in an act I consider a crime. The removal of your country's gold reserves was presented to us as a financial prudence, but in reality it was nothing more than theft from a newly formed nation. The attached documents provide the evidence and location. The gold taken from your country was segregated in French reserves, partly for administrative reasons, but also because of the tacit acceptance of its suspect status. I spent decades quietly serving your country, establishing education projects and health initiatives in rural areas, striving to repay a debt I should never have incurred alone. This final act of disclosure is not enough to earn absolution, but it may ensure that justice prevails. The evidence I have withheld will withstand scrutiny in international courts if necessary. France has changed since 1960, and so has the world. I hope that recognition and reparations can be achieved without conflict. With deep regret and hope for reconciliation, Jean-Baptiste Mercier. The letter was dated January 1965, 5 years after independence. He spent the rest of his life trying to make amends, Ouedraogo said quietly. Traoré carefully reread the letter, and it gave us the opportunity to recover what was stolen. But the most pressing question remained: how would they use this information? The map showed a high-security French government facility. Even if there was evidence of historical theft, they couldn't simply walk in and demand access. We need leverage, Traoré decided, and that means having this evidence secure and authenticated before France even knows we have it. Within hours, digital copies of all the materials in the vaults in Switzerland and France were transmitted through secure channels to trusted legal advisors in several countries. The physical documents were securely delivered to diplomatic bags sent to Ouagadougou. As dawn broke in Paris, Traoré made his boldest move yet. He contacted the French president's office directly and requested an urgent private meeting on a hysterical matter affecting both countries. This unusual request, coming from an African leader not officially in France, created exactly the diplomatic turmoil Traoré had anticipated. By mid-morning, French intelligence confirmed Traoré was in Paris, creating a delicate situation. Making his unofficial visit public would have raised questions. Ignoring a head of state's request would have created diplomatic problems. After hours of secret negotiations, an answer arrived. The French president would have a private meeting with Traoré at the Élysée Palace that evening. "They're trying to understand why I'm here and what I know," Traoré said as he prepared for the meeting with Ouedraogo. "This uncertainty gives us an advantage." The presidential palace was a painful reminder of France's imperial history, a splendor built in part by colonial exploitation. As Traoré was led through ornate corridors to a private meeting room, he carried with him not only Mercier's evidence, but also the weight of the historical injustice that had shaped his country's course. French President Marcel Fournier greeted him with a diplomatic cordiality that could not quite conceal his surprise and concern. "President Traoré, this is truly an unexpected pleasure. It is unusual for you to be in Paris without official notification. Some matters require secrecy before they become official," Traoré replied, taking a seat offered to him at a small conference table. "So, what is the matter that has brought you to Paris so urgently?" Fournier asked. Traoré placed a file on the table. 40 tons of gold, President Fournier, were stolen from my country in 1960, a few days before our independence. Fournier's expression remained neutral, but the slight tension in his posture betrayed the impact of Traoré's words. "This is a significant claim about events that occurred more than 60 years ago. Not an allegation, but a documented fact." Traoré opened the folder and showed copies of colonial records, Mercier's diary entries, and photographs of the gold extraction. "Your predecessor's administration systematically depleted our national reserves before independence, ensuring that Burkina Faso, despite producing gold for decades, began its journey as a nation in poverty." Fournier examined the documents with the careful detachment of a seasoned politician. "These appear to be colonial administrative records, President Traoré. Historical documents can provide important information, but drawing modern conclusions requires careful context." "The context is clear," Traoré replied calmly. "Gold belonging to the people of Burkina Faso was taken without consent or compensation. This gold, worth approximately 2.3 billion euros at current prices, has been held in French reserves for over 60 years. Even if these events occurred as you describe, Fournier said carefully, there are complex questions of historical jurisdiction, colonial-era legal frameworks, and the statute of limitations. I was expecting this answer, Traore said, and produced the final document, a map of the French gold depot, complete with detailed descriptions. That's why I brought this too. Fournier's composure visibly faltered when he recognized the secret floor plan of an existing national security facility. Where did you get this? He asked. From the same French official who documented the gold transport and spent the rest of his life regretting his role in it. Jean-Baptiste Mercier meticulously concealed the evidence, including the specific location where colonial gold was stored separately from other reserves. The room fell silent as the full significance of this settled between them. Traore not only possessed historical evidence of the gold transport, he also possessed current, classified information about one of France's most secure facilities. What exactly are you proposing, President Traoré? Fournier finally asked. Justice, not conflict, Traoré replied. The return of the taken remains a process that allows both nations to proceed honorably. This evidence could be submitted to international courts or made public, which could create a diplomatic crisis that neither of us wants. Or we could resolve this historical wrong directly between us. Fournier studied him carefully. You understand that accepting such a claim could expose France to similar demands from other former colonies. Perhaps this conversation is overdue, Traoré said, but each case will require specific evidence, and that evidence may not be as readily available elsewhere as it is here. I don't want to set a precedent. I simply want to redress a specific historical injustice committed against our country. Furthermore, 5 hours of intense negotiations followed, with additional French officials secretly brought into the meeting. Legal experts, financial advisors, and diplomatic strategists participated in the increasingly complex discussion of how to address a 60-year-old theft without creating modern diplomatic chaos. By midnight, the outlines of an agreement had emerged. France would not directly acknowledge the theft, but would establish a historical reconciliation and development fund, specifically for Burkina Faso, which would be capitalized with gold transfers equivalent to the amount documented in Mercier's evidence, adjusted for inflation and interest. The transfer would be structured as voluntary historical recognition, not compensation for the theft, and would be phased in over 3 years. In return, Burkina Faso would commit to using the funds transparently for national development, and major projects would be overseen jointly by France and Burkina Faso. All evidence collected by Traoré would remain confidential, and the original documents would be stored in a newly established historical archive accessible to scholars from both countries. As the meeting concluded in the early morning hours, President Fournier asked the question that had been on his mind throughout the discussions. How did you discover this after all these years? Mercier's evidence was supposed to remain secret until 2025. It will remain a secret, Traoré admitted. Someone sent me an early notification and directed me to the safe in Switzerland. I still don't know who it was or why now. Fournier nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps not all debts are historical. Good night, President Traoré. Our teams will finalize the details in the coming weeks. Dawn was breaking in Paris as Traoré left the Élysée Palace. He would be returning to Burkina Faso in a few hours, carrying with him not gold, not yet, but perhaps something even more valuable, the promise of historical justice and the resources that would transform his country's future. The journey back to Ouagadougou passed in careful silence. No explanation was given, no hint given about the momentous agreement. Upon his return, Traoré gathered his closest advisors to explain what had happened and the complex task ahead. We have achieved something unprecedented, he told them. Not just the recovery of stolen resources, but the acknowledgement, however carefully worded, of the historical wrongs that shaped our country's course. The next 3 months were devoted to the careful negotiation of the final agreement. International legal experts, financial advisors, and diplomatic strategists worked to establish a framework that would meet the needs of both countries while genuinely benefiting Burkina Faso's development. All the while, the mystery persisted. Who had sent Traoré the initial message and uncovered Mercier's evidence 5 years earlier? A secret investigation, led by Security Chief Ouedraogo, finally yielded an answer. Jean-Baptiste Mercier had died in 1998 after decades of quiet philanthropy in rural Burkina Faso. His only child, Marie Mercier, had continued her father's educational endeavors through a small foundation. When he was diagnosed with a terminal illness in early 2025, he decided to activate his father's emergency plan early so he could see the solution his father had worked for through to fruition. Marie Mercier died 2 weeks after sending Traoré the notice, never to learn whether her father's 60-year quest for liberation would succeed. 6 months after Traoré's secret visit to Paris, an official ceremony was held in Ouagadougou to announce the establishment of the Franco-Burkina Faso Historical Reconciliation and Development Fund. The carefully worded joint statement spoke of redressing historical imbalances and recognizing the complex legacy of the colonial era without explicitly acknowledging the theft. But the essence of the agreement was clear. 2.3 billion euros worth of gold would be transferred to Burkina Faso within 3 years, with the first 10-ton shipment arriving on the same day. Before the public ceremony, Traoré visited the small foundation established by the Mercier family in a rural area outside Ouagadougou. For decades, a modest clinic and school had operated there. These institutions were quietly financed, first by Jean-Baptiste and later by his daughter Marie. A plaque on the school building bore the simple inscription, "In service of a debt that cannot be fully repaid." Traoré arranged for a second plaque to be added below it. Some debts are inherited. Some are chosen. Both have the power to heal. The first projects financed with returned gold. 6 months after Traoré's secret visit to Paris, a formal ceremony was held in Ouagadougou to announce the establishment of the Franco-Burkina Faso Historical Reconciliation and Development Fund. The carefully worded joint statement spoke of redressing historical imbalances and recognizing the complex legacy of the colonial era, without explicitly acknowledging the theft. But the essence of the agreement was clear. 2.3 billion euros worth of gold would be transferred to Burkina Faso within 3 years, with the first 10-ton shipment arriving on the same day as the announcement. Before the public ceremony, Traoré visited the small foundation established by the Mercier family in a rural area outside Ouagadougou. For decades, a modest clinic and school had operated there. These institutions were quietly financed, first by Jean-Baptiste and later by his daughter Marie. A plaque on the school building bore the simple inscription, "In service of a debt that cannot be fully repaid." Traoré ensured that a second plaque was added beneath it. Some debts are inherited, some are chosen. Both have the power to heal. The first projects financed by the returned gold were taking shape across Burkina Faso. Expanded educational facilities, modernized health infrastructure, sustainable agriculture initiatives, and renewable energy development. Unlike previous foreign aid, these resources, which often came with restrictive conditions, were entirely Burkina Faso-owned and provided the possibility of truly sovereign development. Addressing the nation after the formal agreement, Traoré emphasized that the return of the gold was not merely financial compensation, but also the restoration of a possibility. What was taken 60 years ago wasn't just gold, he told his people. It was opportunity. It was the chance for a newly independent nation to chart its own course. This opportunity, delayed but not denied, is now returning to us, not as charity or aid, but as long-delayed justice. International reaction to the agreement was diverse. Some former colonial powers watched the situation with concern, worried that similar demands might arise. Others saw an opportunity to right historical wrongs through negotiation rather than conflict. For African countries, Burkina Faso's success was a turning point, concrete proof that historical justice could be achieved through persistence, evidence, and strategic diplomacy. A year after the first gold transfer, Traoré approved the establishment in Ouagadougou of a small museum dedicated to documenting the gold's removal in 1960 and its return 60 years later. Among the museum's main exhibits were Jean-Baptiste Mercier's diary and the golden key that unlocked not just a safe, but also the path to historical justice. A special wing of the museum was dedicated to Marie Mercier and her father, recognizing how a family's 60-year quest for atonement helped reshape a nation's future. The exhibition featured a simple but powerful quote from Jean-Baptiste's final letter. True reconciliation requires not only the acknowledgement of past wrongs, but also concrete steps toward reparation. Some debts can never be fully paid, but these efforts themselves have a healing power. For Ibrahim Traoré, the return of the gold meant more than mere material resources. It was proof that historical injustices, no matter how distant, can be remedied. That no matter how long the historical process, when guided by perseverance, evidence, and moral clarity, can move toward justice. As new schools, hospitals, and infrastructure were built in Burkina Faso, funded by resources denied to previous generations, Traoré frequently reflected on the improbable chain of events that had made this possible. A colonial official's crisis of conscience, a daughter's determination to fulfill her father's mission, and a mysterious message arriving at just the right time. The gold stolen in the darkness had returned in the light, transforming not only Burkina Faso's development process, but also the debates about colonial legacy and historical justice. What began as a quest to recover the stolen treasure had blossomed into something more profound, a model for addressing historical wrongs through a shared commitment to evidence, negotiation, and reconciliation. In his presidential office in Ouagadougou, Traoré kept a small gold coin on his desk. This coin was the first to be ceremoniously minted for reclaimed bullion. It served as a daily reminder that justice, sometimes delayed by generations, is possible when pursued with patience, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The coin bore a simple inscription in French and Burkina Faso's indigenous language, More, justice from the past, possibility for the future. 2 years after the historic return of Burkina Faso's gold, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the observation deck of the newly completed National Development Center in Ouagadougou. The impressive circular building, constructed with locally sourced materials and powered entirely by solar energy, housed the administrative headquarters for all projects financed by the reclaimed gold. From this vantage point, he could see the transformation sweeping across the capital. New schools, medical facilities, research institutes, and infrastructure projects. But more significant than the physical changes was the psychological shift. For the first time since independence, Burkina Faso was unquestionably developing on its own resources according to its own priorities. Impressive sight, isn't it? The quarterly development reports are ready for review, said Finance Minister Ouadraogo, accompanying him along the railing. The quarterly development reports are ready for review. Traoré nodded. Transparency was central to his approach to the recovered gold. Every gram was accounted for, every project meticulously documented and made available for public scrutiny. This wasn't just about preventing corruption. It was about ensuring that the recovered wealth truly belonged to all Burkinabe people. Have you heard from our geological survey teams? Traoré asked. Yes, actually. That's the other reason I called you. Ouadraogo handed him a tablet with preliminary findings. The new geological mapping project has identified promising mineral deposits in the eastern provinces. These deposits are much richer than we anticipated. This was another initiative funded by the recovered gold, a comprehensive geological survey using advanced technology to accurately map Burkina Faso's mineral resources. For decades, the country relied on colonial-era research or assessments conducted by foreign companies seeking to exploit its resources. If these findings are correct, Traoré said, examining the data, we could have gold reserves similar to Ghana's. This is a preliminary assessment, Ouadraogo confirmed. But there's something else. He moved to another screen displaying chemical analysis results. The samples contain exceptionally high concentrations of rare earth elements, particularly neodymium and praseodymium, essential components for renewable energy technologies and advanced electronics. Traoré looked up from his tablet. This could change everything. It already has, he said, with a slight smile. News of our geological survey has somehow reached international mining companies. 3 of them have already requested a meeting to discuss partnership opportunities. Traoré wasn't surprised. The global race for rare earths had intensified as countries transitioned to renewable energy and electric transportation. Currently, most production was concentrated in China. creating a supply problem for Western countries that they wanted to address. Let me guess, they're offering technical expertise and development capital in exchange for favorable mining rights. Ouedraogo nodded. It's the same model that has exploited Africa's wealth for generations, but there's a significant difference now. We know exactly what we have, Traore concluded, and we have the resources to develop it ourselves if necessary. The recovered gold had given Burkina Faso more than just development capital. It had given it leverage and independence in negotiations. No longer dependent on foreign investment at all costs, the country could operate from a position of informed strength. Arrange meetings with all relevant parties, Traore decided, but also begin developing our own capacity assessment. I want to know exactly what Burkina Faso needs to process these materials domestically. As they were about to leave the observation deck, Traore's head of security approached them with an urgent expression. "Mr. President, there is a situation that requires your immediate attention," Ouedraogo said quietly. "A secure package has been delivered to the presidential office. It appears to be the same source as the original gold manifest." 20 minutes later, Traore was in the secure conference room with his closest advisors. On the table before them sat an unmarked envelope, the contents of which had already been inspected for danger. Inside was a flash drive and a note written in the same distinctive handwriting as the message that had launched their journey 2 years earlier. The note was brief. "Gold was just the beginning. Marie gave me one last assignment before she died. The evidence in this memo reveals Operation Crocodile, a systematic misdirection of resource exploration in French-speaking African countries from 1960 to 1985. What they found and reported was deliberately misleading. The coordinates are attached. 48 hours before others receive this information, an old debt continues to unravel. Security Chief Ouedraogo had already verified the contents of the flash drive. The drive contained hundreds of classified documents from French geological survey missions conducted in the former colonies after independence. Crucially, it was a coordinated program to provide incomplete or deliberately misleading geological data to newly independent African countries, while demonstrating that accurate exploration was being conducted for French companies and the government. "If this is true," Professor Cabaret said, as he examined the documents, "it means that all resource exploration conducted in French-speaking Africa during this period potentially underestimated or completely missed critical mineral deposits, especially resources that had no commercial value at the time, but later became very important," Minister Ouedraogo added, "like rare earth elements." Traore examined the coordinates included in the message. They indicated locations in 5 West African countries, all former French colonies. Each corresponded to resource deposits that had been identified but deliberately omitted from official reports. The initial coordinates perfectly matched the results of our new research in the eastern provinces, Ouedraogo confirmed. The deposits our geologists have just discovered were actually documented 60 years ago and then hidden. The implications were staggering. Beyond Burkina Faso, this suggested that Niger, Mali, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire might also possess significant undocumented mineral resources that could transform the development trajectory of these countries, just as the recovered gold had transformed Burkina Faso. "We must verify this information immediately," Traore decided, "and understand why we received it 48 hours before anyone else." The answer to the second question arrived late that evening, when intelligence sources reported unusual activity at several major mining companies with interests in West Africa. Executives were called back from vacation, technical teams were mobilized, and legal departments began working overtime. "Someone has leaked clues about the region's massive rare earth deposits," Ouedraogo reported. "Not exact coordinates, but enough to trigger a corporate race for gold. Within days, these companies will be approaching all the governments in the region with offers, proposals, and pressure, creating a competitive environment where countries can make hasty decisions without full information," Traore concluded, "unless, of course, they already know what they have." The decision was made quickly. Traore personally contacted the presidents of the other 4 countries mentioned in the documents, requesting urgent secure communications. Within hours, he shared the evidence with each leader, explaining its source and significance. We have 48 hours before mining companies start approaching us with proposals based on decades of information we've been unaware of, he told his colleagues. I propose we use this time to coordinate our response. His proposed plan was unprecedented, a unified regional approach to resource development with joint technical assessment, coordinated negotiating positions, and mutual support. Instead of competing with each other for foreign investment, the 5 countries would form a united front, leveraging their collective resource wealth for truly equitable partnerships. Burkina Faso's experience with repatriated gold taught us the power of negotiating by leveraging knowledge and power, Traore explained. Imagine that power growing exponentially across 5 countries. The response was cautious, but compelling. Decades of regional rivalry and shifting political alliances had posed obstacles to such cooperation. But Traore's evidence was compelling. Each leader agreed to send technical and ministerial representatives to an emergency summit in Ouagadougou the next day. As preparations for the summit continued, Traoré received an unexpected message from French President Fournier requesting an urgent private meeting. When the secure connection was established, Fournier's expression was serious. President Traoré, I have just been informed that potentially destabilizing information is circulating regarding historical resource exploration in West Africa. Interesting timing, Traoré replied neutrally. We have recently completed our own new geological surveys, and we have obtained some rather surprising results. Fournier paused and carefully chose his words. I want to make it clear that historical inconsistencies in geological reporting occurred under previous administrations with different transparency standards. Just as gold mining occurred under previous administrations, Traoré said, but we have found a way to redress historical wrongs while building a more constructive relationship. That's exactly what I hope for, Fournier said. France wants to offer technical assistance in verifying new resource discoveries and to build development partnerships that reflect modern standards of equity. Traoré clearly understood the subtext. France was trying to forestall revelations by positioning itself as a partner, not a rival, in case the historical deception were made public. Thank you for your offer, President Fournier, but this situation has now gone beyond bilateral relations between our countries. I have shared this information with the other affected countries, and tomorrow we will have a meeting to discuss a coordinated approach. Fournier couldn't hide his surprise. A regional approach will be complex. Each country has different relationships with its international partners and different development priorities. Perhaps, but we all share the experience of making decisions without full knowledge of our own resources. That will change now. After the meeting concluded, Traoré reflected on how dramatically the dynamics had changed. 2 years earlier, he had been the one calling for meetings, carefully manipulating French power structures to try to reclaim what had been taken from them. Now, France was taking a preemptive step, establishing contact to maintain its influence in a rapidly changing situation. The next day's summit exceeded all expectations. Despite historical rivalries and differing political systems, the 5 West African leaders quickly found common ground in the face of emerging truths about decades of resource mismanagement. Technical teams compared newly revealed historical research with their own recent assessments, confirming the accuracy of the documents Marie Mercier had withheld. The same pattern is evident in all 5 countries, said the head of Burkina Faso's geological survey. Critical strategic minerals, particularly rare earths, uranium, and some high-quality precious metals, were systematically excluded from official reports submitted to our post-independence governments. While companies affiliated with the French state retained mining rights in key areas identified in actual exploration, Niger's mining minister added, this wasn't just information asymmetry, it was strategic resource control. By evening, the outlines of an unprecedented agreement emerged, the West African Resource Sovereignty Alliance. The alliance's founding principles were joint technical assessment of all newly discovered resource deposits, coordinated negotiations with international mining interests, development of regional processing capacity to ensure value added remains in Africa, transparency mechanisms modeled on Burkina Faso's gold recovery framework, a unified approach to addressing historical resource misdirection with former colonial powers. Most importantly, The alliance established minimum standards for all resource development agreements, often including local ownership, mandatory technology transfer, environmental protections, and direct links between resource extraction and tangible development outcomes. As the summit concluded, Traoré addressed the other leaders. What began with Burkina Faso's gold has revealed a broader pattern affecting all our nations. But the response to this pattern is what truly matters. Together, we have the opportunity to transform how Africa's resources serve the African people. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. The next day, when international mining executives began arriving with hastily prepared proposals, they encountered not individual countries eager to invest at any cost, but a coordinated alliance of individuals fully aware of their assets and wielding unprecedented influence in the negotiations. Within weeks, the revelations of Operation Crocodile spread beyond the 5 countries initially affected. Other former colonies began to launch their own investigations into historical resource exploration, challenging decades-old assumptions about their mineral wealth. For Ibrahim Traoré, the second chapter of this unfolding story meant something even more significant than the return of the gold. While the recovered wealth altered the trajectory of Burkina Faso's development, this new revelation transformed the entire paradigm of resource management in the region. 3 months after the alliance was formed, the 5 leaders reconvened in Ouagadougou and signed formal agreements outlining the framework for cooperation. The ceremony took place in a new wing of the museum dedicated to Operation Crocodile and its revelation, which documented the gold's return. In his speech, Traoré acknowledged the source of both revelations. None of this would have been possible without the courage of 2 individuals, Jean-Baptiste Mercier, who documented the theft of the gold, and his daughter, Marie, who ensured the truth remained hidden. Their actions remind us that historical justice often depends on individual conscience, which transcends institutional loyalty. The mystery surrounding Marie Mercier's final actions were partially resolved thanks to a careful investigation. Before her death, she had entrusted the Operation Crocodile documents to a former colleague at the Educational Foundation, a Burkina historian who waited to release the information until the gold's return was successfully completed. On the evening of the signing ceremony, Traoré sat in silent contemplation in the museum gallery. He stopped in front of a supple display case displaying Jean-Baptiste Mercier's original diary and the golden key that unlocked not just a safe deposit box, but a series of revelations about colonial resource extraction. "A very large legacy from a conscientious colonial administrator," said a voice behind him. Traoré turned and saw President Diop of Mali, one of the alliance's most enthusiastic supporters. "The true legacy is not what he has brought to light," said Traoré. "A very large legacy from a conscientious colonial administrator," said a voice behind him. Traoré turned and saw President Diop of Mali, one of the alliance's most enthusiastic supporters. "The true legacy is not just what he has brought to light," Traoré replied, "but what he has now enabled us to build." Diop nodded thoughtfully. "For decades, while competing with each other for foreign investment and aid, we talked about a united Africa. Perhaps resource sovereignty is the foundation upon which a meaningful union can finally be built." As the 5 delegations walked through the museum toward the reception, Diop asked the question on many people's minds. "Do you think there will be more revelations? Are there more Mercier documents waiting to be discovered?" Traoré considered this carefully. This pattern demonstrates a systematic approach to maintaining control even after formal colonization ended. Resources were only one aspect. I think there's more to uncover about the various ways newly independent countries were manipulated into dependency. So we must be prepared, Diop concluded. That evening's reception represented more than just a diplomatic formality. It represented a real shift in regional relations. From competition to cooperation, from isolation to mutual support. Technical teams from the 5 countries were already working together, sharing their expertise and developing common approaches to resource assessment, extraction, and processing. Most importantly, negotiations with international mining companies had taken on a completely different character. No longer able to pit countries against each other or exploit information asymmetries, the companies were adapting to the new requirements for true partnership, rather than mere extraction. As the evening drew to a close, Traoré received an update from Security Chief Ouagadougou that added a new dimension to the unfolding story. An analysis of communication patterns related to leaked information about rare earth deposits in West Africa had revealed something unexpected. The source was not European or American mining companies, but Chinese geological research institutes. It seems someone wanted to trigger a rush of Western companies into the region, Ouedraogo said quietly, perhaps hoping our governments would quickly form alliances with familiar Western companies before the Chinese companies could consolidate their positions. This makes our alliance even more crucial, Traore said. We are not only addressing historical exploitation, but also occupying an independent position in the current geopolitical resource competition. This revelation confirmed Traore's suspicions. The timing of Marie Mercier's disclosure was linked to current geopolitical maneuvering regarding critical minerals. Competition among global powers for resource access was creating both risks and opportunities for resource-rich African countries. The next morning, before the other leaders departed, Traore proposed expanding the scope of their alliance. Beyond addressing historical resource misdirection and coordinating current developments, he proposed establishing a regional strategic minerals reserve, a collective holding of a portion of extracted resources to gain leverage in global markets and ensure long-term benefits for future generations. Africa has been a source of raw materials for too long, but it hasn't captured their full value, he explained. A strategic reserve would give us a position not only as a supplier, but also as a stakeholder in global resource governance. The proposal gained immediate support, particularly given the prediction that global demand for rare earths and other critical minerals will increase significantly in the coming decades. Rather than simply extracting and selling these resources at current prices, the alliance would hold significant reserves and profit from their appreciation over time. When the summit concluded and the visiting delegations departed, Traore returned to his office and found a small package on his desk. Inside was a worn, leather-bound book with no notes or explanations. Opening it, he discovered Marie Mercier's personal diary, covering the final years of her life. In his final entry, written a few days before his death, he wrote, "My father began this work believing that one person with access to the truth could make a difference. I end this work knowing he was right, but incomplete. Truth only matters when it reaches those with the strength and moral clarity to act upon it. I believe I have found such a person in President Traoré. Gold was stolen before independence. Knowledge of what lies beneath our soil was stolen after. Both thefts serve the same purpose, to create the illusion of political freedom while maintaining economic control. As my term ends, I have ensured the recovery not only of resources, but also of possibilities. Those who build with these recovered truths can create the future denied to us." Traore closed the diary thoughtfully. Marie Mercier had seen the return of the gold not as an end, but as a beginning, the first step in addressing systematic post-colonial resource control. Her final actions were precisely calculated to trigger not only Burkina Faso's development, but also regional transformation. In the months that followed, the alliance's influence spread far beyond its 5 founding members. Inspired by this model, other African countries began to build similar regional cooperation frameworks around shared resources. International financial institutions, recognizing the shifting power dynamics, developed new approaches to resource-supported development that emphasized local processing and value added. Most importantly, the narrative surrounding African resources was shifting, from minerals to be exploited to strategic assets to be managed for long-term national interests. The transformation, which began with 40 tons of recovered gold, was triggering a reassessment of resource sovereignty on the continent. On the first anniversary of the alliance's founding, Ibrahim Traoré visited the small foundation established by the Mercier family in rural Burkina Faso. The modest school and clinic, expanded with funds from the recovered gold, now served as a regional education and health center. A simple monument stood in the school's central courtyard, a golden globe representing the earth, illuminating Africa's resource deposits from within. The monument bore the following inscription in several languages: "Long-buried truths still shape the present. Long-delayed justice still transforms the future. What was hidden has been revealed. What was taken has been given back. The true wealth of nations lies not in the resources extracted, but in those built with knowledge, sovereignty, and vision." As children played around the monument, Traoré reflected on how the remorse of a single colonial ruler preserved and strengthened by his daughter's determination, triggered events that reshaped the resource management paradigm not only in Burkina Faso, but across the entire continent. The golden legacy was no longer simply wealth reclaimed from the past, but a future built on the foundations of transparency, sovereignty, and regional cooperation. What began as a quest to recover stolen treasure had transformed into something far more valuable, a template for transforming historical injustice into a future possibility. 5 years after the founding of the West African Resource Sovereignty Alliance, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the stage of the newly completed African Institute for Resource Management in Ouagadougou. Before him sat delegates from 37 African countries, gathered for the first Pan-African Resource Sovereignty Summit. The institute was a testament to how far they had come, a world-class research and training facility built with Burkina Faso's reclaimed gold revenues, led by African scientists, economists, and policy experts who had once worked for international mining companies, but returned to contribute to the continent's transformation. Traoré began his speech by reviewing the historic meeting. Welcome to Ouagadougou. 5 years ago, we stood at a turning point. 5 countries, armed with newly discovered knowledge of our own resources, were subjected to the same patterns of extraction and exploitation that had shaped our post-colonial experience for decades. Traoré pointed to the other 4 founding members of the alliance, seated in the front row, the presidents of Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire. What began as a response to historical injustice has evolved into something far more significant, a new model for how Africa's resources can serve African development on African terms. This was evident in Burkina Faso and other alliance countries. New processing facilities ensured that raw materials were no longer simply exported, but were transformed into higher-value products within Africa's borders. Education systems were revitalized, with a special emphasis on geosciences, engineering, and resource management. Health infrastructure expanded significantly, reaching previously underserved rural areas. Most importantly, the alliance's strategic mineral reserves have become one of the world's largest reserves of rare earths and critical minerals, giving member countries unprecedented leverage in negotiations with global technology manufacturers and renewable energy developers. Today, we come together to extend this model across our continent, Traoré continued, not through centralized control or forced uniformity, but through shared principles, mutual support, and recognition of our shared interests. The summit's agenda was ambitious, establishing a continent-wide framework for resource management, technical cooperation protocols, coordinated negotiating positions with international partners, and standardized transparency requirements for all mining activities. But before delving into these policy discussions, Traoré touched on the human story that made all this possible. None of what we have achieved would have been possible without 2 individuals who chose conscience over complicity, he said, highlighting the portrait of Jean-Baptiste and Marie Mercier hanging in the Institute's main hall. A father and daughter who dedicated their lives to uncovering the truths buried by powerful interests and ensuring those truths reach those who can act. The Mercier legacy has become more publicly understood over the past 5 years. After Marie's diary was discovered, Traoré authorized the publication of the Mercier's writings, creating a powerful historical record of individual moral courage in the face of both colonial usurpation and systemic injustice. Their story reminds us that transformation often begins with truth, disturbing, uncomfortable truths that challenge established power. But truth alone is not enough. It must be combined with action, vision, and the courage to imagine different possibilities. As the summit began in earnest, Traoré took a moment to meet privately with a special guest, Pierre Mercier, Jean-Baptiste's grandson and Marie's nephew, who had been to Canada and worked as an environmental engineer. Your family's legacy has transformed not just Burkina Faso, but increasingly the entire continent, Traoré said, in a quiet meeting room adjacent to the main hall. Pierre, a thoughtful man in his 40s, who closely resembled his grandfather, shook his head in silent wonder. I knew my grandfather had worked in the colonial administration and later been involved in educational projects in West Africa. But the full extent of his activities, his documentation of gold mining, his manipulation of geological surveys, was completely unknown to me until your government contacted us. Did your Aunt Marie never share this with you? Traore asked curiously. We weren't close, Pierre admitted. After my grandfather devoted so much of his life and resources to his work in Africa, there was a rift in the family. My father, Marie's brother, thought he was neglecting his family obligations for a foreign cause, and he didn't understand or approve of it. But now you're here, Traore remarked. Pierre nodded. Once I understood what they were doing, the moral stance they were taking, I couldn't stay away. I wanted to see what their actions amounted to. Traore led him to a large window overlooking the Institute's central courtyard, where delegates from all over Africa gathered between sessions. Behind them, Ouagadougou's transformed skyline appeared, with new developments stretching to the horizon. What you're seeing is just the beginning, Traore said. Physical infrastructure, economic growth, these are important but secondary. The real transformation is in governance, in sovereignty, in our relationship with our own resources and the world. Turning to Pierre, he said, your grandfather and your aunt understood something fundamental. True independence requires not only political sovereignty, but also resource sovereignty. They provided the proof that enabled us to reclaim both. The summit lasted 3 days, with intense discussions on technical cooperation, legal frameworks, and development strategies. Differences between countries with different political systems, historical experiences, and resource profiles created natural tensions, but a shared commitment to resource sovereignty provided a unifying principle. On the final day, 32 of the 37 participating countries signed the Ouagadougou Declaration, establishing the Pan-African Resource Governance Framework and committing to harmonized transparency standards, technical cooperation, and mutual support in negotiations with international partners. At the end of the ceremony, the President of South Africa, home to the continent's most significant mineral wealth, approached Traore. What you are building here began with a specific historical injustice committed against Burkina Faso, he said. But it has evolved into something universal, a new approach to resource management that can benefit every country on our continent, and potentially beyond that. Traore added, the principles of transparency, sovereign development, and intergenerational equity are not unique to Africa. They represent a more equitable approach to resource management globally. This broader significance was becoming increasingly clear. In the 5 years since the alliance's founding, several Latin American countries had adopted similar models for their own resource development processes. Indigenous communities in North America and Australia had cited the West African approach in negotiations with mining companies and national governments. At the summit's close, the Institute's centerpiece, the Pan-African Geological Data Repository, was inaugurated. This secure facility housed comprehensive research on the continent's resource deposits, conducted using advanced technology by African geologists, ensuring that information about Africa's wealth could never again be manipulated or concealed from its people. As the delegates departed for their home countries, Traore sat quietly in his office overlooking the city. On his desk sat 2 items that had become personally important to him: the golden key that opened the safe deposit box in Paris and a small gold bar from the first shipment returned. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Finance Minister Ouagadougou entered with a tablet containing the latest economic indicators. The numbers are extraordinary, he said, handing her the device. Annual GDP growth is 8.7% and has been sustained for 5 years. Poverty reduction has surpassed all estimates. Education enrollment has reached historic highs. Traore nodded, examining the data. What about strategic mineral reserves? The current value is 12.3 billion euros and growing. As global demand for rare earths continues to grow, our position is strengthening accordingly. But beyond these national development indicators, both knew that the most important changes were qualitative, not quantitative. The transformation in how Burkina Faso and increasingly other African countries interact with the world, particularly regarding their natural resources. There's another development you should pay attention to, Ouagadougou added. French President Fournier has requested a state visit next month. The official goal is to strengthen bilateral relations, but our sources indicate he wants to discuss the formal acknowledgement of the mishandling of historical resources. This would be similar to our gold restitution agreement, but expanded to include the Operation Crocodile revelations. Traore raised his eyebrows. Interesting timing, just as our Pan-African framework is gaining momentum. Indeed, it is. France seems to prefer to address these issues bilaterally, rather than face a unified stance from the continent. Plan the visit, Traore decided, but make it clear that all discussions on historical resource management must include representatives of all affected countries. This shift in diplomatic approach reflected how radically power dynamics had shifted. African countries were no longer responding to agendas set by former colonial powers. Increasingly, they were setting the terms of their own participation. The next day, Traore traveled to the rural area where the Mercier Foundation's school and clinic had become a thriving community development center. Expanded with resources from recovered gold, the center served as both an educational center and a living museum, documenting the process from colonial-era resource extraction to sovereignty-era development. Pierre Mercier wanted to accompany him to see the place where his grandfather and aunt had dedicated so much of their lives and resources. As he toured the facilities and met with students and healthcare workers, Pierre was visibly moved. "My grandfather never talked about his work in colonial rule," he said as he walked through the gardens planted by local school children. "Now I understand why. The weight of what he witnessed, the weight of what he was a part of. Yet he chose a different path," Traore observed. Not just remorse or guilt, but active reparation. First, through his documentation of gold extraction, then through his decades of quiet service to the communities most affected by resource extraction. At the center of the complex, they stopped before a simple monument, a replica of the original school Jean-Baptiste Mercier funded in the 1970s. A plaque bore his original words, "In the service of a debt that can never be fully repaid." Pierre gently touched the plaque. "I always wondered why he spent so much time in Africa, why he directed so much of our family's resources there. Now I understand. He was trying to maintain a balance that could never truly be balanced." But this attempt was far more significant than he could have ever imagined, Traore agreed. What began as personal atonement has triggered national transformation, then regional cooperation, and now potentially continental realignment. That evening, returning to Ouagadougou, Traore received news that would add a new dimension to the unfolding story. Researchers at the African Institute for Resource Management, while examining the documents of Operation Crocodile, discovered references to similar geological survey manipulations in former British, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies. This pattern wasn't unique to French-speaking Africa, the research director explained in his report. It appears to be standard practice among colonial powers, providing newly independent countries with incomplete or misleading information about their own resource wealth. This discovery suggested that the resource sovereignty movement could extend far beyond the original five-nation alliance and potentially encompass the entire continent. Countries that had long operated with incomplete information about their own mineral wealth might now have the opportunity to reassess their resource governance based on accurate information. A week after the summit concluded, Traore addressed the nation in a televised address, assessing the journey that began 5 years earlier with a mysterious envelope. "When we received proof of our stolen gold, we faced a choice," he told the Burkinabe people. "We could pursue our narrow national interests and seek reparations for ourselves, or we could acknowledge that our experiences reflected a broader pattern affecting many countries." He outlined how the initial gold return laid the foundation for the West African Resource Sovereignty Alliance, which in turn inspired the Pan-African framework established at the recent summit. What began with the recovery of stolen wealth has evolved into something far more valuable, a new model of resource governance based on transparency, sovereignty, and shared prosperity. The value of gold, however important, pales in comparison to the value of the governance principles it helped us establish. Most notably, he announced the establishment of the Mercier Scholarship Program, funded by the proceeds of the recovered gold, and dedicated to training Africa's next generation of geologists, mining engineers, and resource management experts. The program will bring students from across the continent to study at the new institute in Ouagadougou and create a network of professionals dedicated to transparent, sovereign resource development. The greatest legacy of our golden journey is not the wealth recovered, but the knowledge gained, the sovereignty strengthened, and the opportunities created for future generations. 10 years after receiving the mysterious envelope that launched this journey, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the first graduation ceremony for the Mercier scholars. 50 young men and women from 23 African countries completed advanced training in resource management, geological assessment, and sustainable development. In his address to the graduates, Traoré described how Jean-Baptiste Mercier's decision to document gold extraction and conceal evidence of resource exploration manipulation triggered events that fundamentally reshaped Africa's relationship with its natural resources. "You are starting your career at a crucial time," he told the graduates. "For generations, Africa's resources have enriched others while our own people have been trapped in poverty. This cycle is now being broken. Not through conflict or isolation, but through knowledge, collaboration, and strategic vision." The evidence was visible across the continent. The Pan-African Resource Management Framework had expanded to encompass 43 countries. Processing facilities enabled the transformation of raw materials into increasingly high-value products within Africa's borders. Strategic mineral reserves have become a major force in global markets, particularly for the materials needed for renewable energy and digital technologies. Most importantly, the relationship between resource extraction and human development has fundamentally changed. Transparent governance mechanisms have enabled the direct translation of mineral wealth into educational advancements, improved healthcare, and infrastructure development. Resource agreements include mandatory provisions for technology transfer, local processing, and environmental protection. Following the ceremony, Traoré visited the Institute's Memorial Hall, where a comprehensive exhibition documented the journey from colonial resource extraction to sovereign development. In the center of the hall stood the original safe from Geneva, the golden key from Paris, and the first gold bar from the returned shipment. Next to these artifacts were portraits of Jean-Baptiste and Marie Mercier, a father and daughter whose moral courage triggered a series of revelations and transformations. Beneath the portraits was a simple inscription in multiple languages: "The truth is revealed, justice is served, a legacy is transformed. From stolen gold to a sovereign future." As Traoré considered these words, he was joined by Pierre Mercier, who maintained his connection to Burkina Faso after the summit and eventually accepted a position as environmental advisor to the Resource Management Institute. "My grandfather could never have imagined this outcome," Pierre said, gesturing to the hall filled with graduates and high-ranking officials from across the continent. His small documentation effort led to the transformation of the continent. "Perhaps not exactly like this," Traoré agreed, "but I think he understood the power of truth revealed to the right people at the right time. That's why he carefully preserved the evidence, and even if he couldn't see the consequences, he ensured it eventually came to light." Together, they watched as the new graduates, the future leaders of Africa's resource management, gathered around the exhibits, absorbing the history that had created their opportunity. The most valuable resource was never the gold itself. Traoré said, "The truth about gold was the truth about how it was extracted, what it represented. This truth created the possibility of true sovereignty, not only politically, but also economically, and in terms of development." As evening fell on Ouagadougou, the city was awash with new structures, research facilities, educational institutions, health centers, and infrastructure developed with resources untapped by previous generations. A similar transformation was seen in other alliance countries, creating a development network in West Africa that is increasingly connected to progress across the continent. Late that night, in his office, Traoré wrote a letter to be placed in the Institute's time capsule, which was scheduled to open in 50 years. "To those of you reading these lines in 2075, the transformation you inherit began with a simple act of conscience. One person's decision to document the truth rather than participate in deception. From this seed emerged the recovery of stolen wealth, then the uncovering of hidden knowledge, and eventually a new model of resource management that transformed not only Burkina Faso, but increasingly our entire continent. This journey taught us that true independence requires not just political sovereignty, but also resource sovereignty, not simply controlling the land, but also knowledge and mastery of what lies beneath. It taught us that transparency is not merely an administrative virtue, but a transformative force that fundamentally reshapes power relations. Most importantly, it taught us that historical injustice cannot be completely eradicated, but can be a catalyst for creating more just systems for future generations. The gold, knowledge, and opportunities taken from us were reclaimed not merely as reparations for past wrongs, but as the foundation of future possibilities. You who read these lines decades later will have built wisely upon this foundation. The sovereignty we have reclaimed has created prosperity we can only dream of, and transformation often comes from the mere remember that it began with a single act of conscience, strengthened by those who saw possibilities where they saw limitations. Justice for the past, possibility for the future. As Traore sealed the letter, he reflected on how the mysterious message that had arrived on his desk 10 years earlier had triggered events no one could fully foresee. Not in Jean-Baptiste Mercier's meticulous documentation, not in Marie Mercier's final act of revelation, not even in Traore's initial search for the stolen gold. What began with the recovery of 40 tons of gold evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of how Africa's resources could serve Africa's development. A transformation not just of wealth, but of knowledge, sovereignty, and possibilities. The golden legacy lay not only in the recovered treasure, but also in the principles of governance, regional cooperation, and the development model it had helped establish. Outside his window, the lights of Ouagadougou glittered in the African night, brighter, more widespread, and more equitably distributed than a decade earlier. A similar transformation was sweeping across the continent, as countries reclaimed not only their resources, but also their futures. The debt Jean-Baptiste Mercier sought to repay, the debt of colonial exploitation and post-colonial deception, could never be fully recouped, but his conscientious act, preserved and strengthened by his daughter's resolve and realized through Traore's leadership, had created something more valuable than repayment, a new beginning. The golden legacy was complete, not in the sense of ending, but in its fullness, a cycle of transformation that began with stolen wealth and culminated in sovereign development. What had been taken in darkness had returned in light, illuminating not only Burkina Faso's past, but also Africa's future.